Hello, and welcome back to RKD Group Chat, the podcast that tells the stories of nonprofit professionals who have dedicated their careers to service. In this episode, I sat down with Thomas Mantz, the president and CEO of Feeding Tampa Bay. From a student struggling to perform in high school to his role today at Feeding Tampa Bay, Thomas's story is built on hard work and a willingness to learn and try new things. Let's start by hearing Thomas share how a role as a security guard out of high school led to a tremendous career journey and a calling to commit his career to the service of others.
Boy, I don't know that that's a simple answer. I was a kid that did not perform well in high school, was not a good student by nature, just wasn't comfortable in the environment. So I went to work right out of high school. I had a couple of different jobs, and I lucked into a security guard job at a large facility for a big corporation. And while I was there, I got to know the woman that ran HR, and she must have seen something in me that I didn't see in me because I was just, walking a guard post. And she said, we've got entry-level jobs. You ought to apply for one. And I said, I don't really think I could do anything that you will. And she's like, just apply. And so I applied and I got my first job, and I was an office assistant. So I delivered the mail, I sorted, I separated, I packaged, I ran errands for a group of about 50 managers. Myself and another person, we answered phones. This is, of course, a bit ago. Your listeners will not see, but I'm in my 60s, and so I'm towards the end of my career. But it was a good start in. And I found that I had a facility for the work, right? I found that I had a good work ethic. I found an environment where I really felt like I belonged and could flourish, that I was judged really on the merits of my efforts. Now, I know school is supposed to be that way, right? At the end of the day, your grades should reflect your efforts, but I didn't find that to be the case in the scholastic world, but I did find it to be the case in the work world. And so I started to experience some success. Different people would see something in me. I probably had two qualities that helped me immensely. One is I would outwork everybody else. I just was of that nature that I was not going to be outworked. Mostly because I was afraid I'd get fired if I didn't, right? Crazy notion, but it drives you, right? The second thing that a quality I found out that I had was I was willing to try new things and do different things. So invariably, when someone would say, "Hey, there's another opportunity. Would you want to volunteer? Do you want to learn this?" My hand would go up and say, "I'll go do it." I was not afraid to figure it out. And so those things really served me well. And my career grew because of it. I had those characteristics, and time and again in a corporate environment, right? This is all in the for-profit world, banking and finance world. I just found myself moving my way through and up those organizations to greater and greater responsibility and more and more opportunity. So probably by the time I was close to 40 years old, I was certainly in my late 30s, I had built a pretty good career. I'd gone to college at night to try and get my degree. But along the way, I found a disconnect probably between what I was doing and what I was interested in.
A disenchantment with the for-profit world led him to take a chance on the nonprofit world. He started out as a volunteer, and through that work ethic and willingness to learn, he has now found himself where he's at today.
So the corporate world offers you an awful lot of great value and return, right? If you're in that place, they compensate you well. There's a lot of opportunity with that. But I found that it was not what resonated with me. And more, I found myself disenchanted, not with the corporate world because they are who they are, but because it didn't fit who I was. And so I actively began to kind of consider what do other people do with their lives? Because I had only taken the next job given to me my entire career. As I was trying to figure out, in the corporate world, you're visited with a certain amount of success, and I had that, and I kept wondering why I was not satisfied with it. And so I started to go out and try and do some other things. And one of the things I decided to do was I started volunteering, or I wanted to start volunteering. So I've shared this story many times, but I was living in New York City at the time. I'm working on Wall Street, and I called the local food bank and said, "Hey, I want to volunteer." Now, this is about 2 days before Thanksgiving. And so the guy on the other end of the phone said, "Yeah, we don't need you." was like, what do you mean you don't need me? He said, buddy, everybody and their brother wants to volunteer at a food bank before Thanksgiving, right? You know this, right? Your listeners know this. He said, people are hungry 365 days a year. Pick another day. He hung up. Right. This is New York City. This is not altogether an unusual conversation. Right. So I was not offended by him hanging up, but his words rang in my ears and I thought about them. And so probably about 60 days later, maybe 3 months later, I found out about and walked into an organization called God's Love We Deliver, which is a nonprofit organization and had started in New York City. And they were principally at that time created to provide healthy homebound meals to AIDS patients in New York City. So think of Meals on Wheels, but directed at a subpopulation. So I would go in and I'd volunteer. And some days I would, I'm coming from running a fairly large part of the bank's portfolio of services. And so I'd come over, but I'd volunteer. And some days I would cut vegetables. Some days I'd work in the office. I still remember the volunteer coordinator, Heather, when I had my orientation, she's like, now, do you think you could answer phones? And at the time, I probably had 1,000 people that were answering phones in my division, right? Whatever it was. I was like, yeah. And she said, can you read from the script? She's wonderful, very thoughtful. I still remember her today. And I had no idea what charities were. I didn't really understand how they worked. Intellectually, I knew the concept, obviously, but I had no idea. I would sit there and I'd answer phones, right? And I'd stuff envelopes or whatever they needed me to do. But I'd look on the wall and I would see names of donors, or this room is named after somebody. I remember thinking, what's all that about? Like, how does all that work? At any rate, I volunteered there for a while. But that, along with, as I mentioned before, just a general dissatisfaction with what I was doing, I decided to push all my chips into the middle of the table and I left. I simply cashed out, told the bank I was going to leave. I gave them a month, finished up a project I was working on. I had no clue where I was going. I just simply knew I had to leave what I was doing, right? This isn't really the smartest career move, but it was the right move for me. And I had some resources to make a decision like this. And so because I owned some property in Florida, I moved to Florida where it's easier to live without a job. And so when I got to Florida, I started volunteering again. So one of the organizations I was volunteering with was a startup clothing distribution charity. And their value proposition was they provided brand new clothing, whereas Goodwill and many other terrific organizations, Dress for Success, work in the used clothes market. The concept that the gentleman that started this charity had was he had talked to a bunch of folks who were homeless. And when he asked them what they needed, they said, we don't get socks and underwear because those can't get donated. It's a sanitary issue, which when you think about when you got dressed this morning, right, that's a pretty critical element, right? For women without bras, just any number of personal comfort and hygiene issues, right? So Henry, the guy that started the charity, said, well, I can figure that out. And he started talking to some friends. He was of means. And he said, hey, he started talking to Kmart and Walmart and others and said, you must have torn packages, or how can I get these things? As it turns out, there was a significant opportunity in brand new clothing. When clothing stores or manufacturing lines would phase out their clothing lines, they would largely burn the clothing that they had because they didn't want to go on a resale market. So Henry said, well, we'll take that. And so much like a food bank works today, the idea was take in the goods, get them sorted, separated, then distribute them back out to charities that are giving clothing to clothing to people that need it. So I started volunteering maybe 60 days into the life of this organization. And so they were wonderful people, but they didn't know how to set up an inventory system, figure out how to fulfill orders. So I came in and I helped with that, and it was pretty easy to say, okay, here, let's do this, let's do that, let's get this set up this way, etc. And the fellow that started the charity asked the woman that was, running it for him, volunteer, running it for him, who's the guy that's doing all this? And she said, well, he's some volunteer. I don't know anything about him. Henry said, I want to meet him. Right. So Liz, the woman, tells me, hey, Henry wants to meet you. I'm like, well, who is Henry? She's like, oh, Henry's a unique guy. You need to meet Henry. I'm like, I don't want to meet Henry. I'm just a volunteer here. Right. And she goes, no, you got to meet Henry. He wants to talk to you. Now, Henry, as it turns out, is a gentleman named Henry Landworth. Henry was a Holocaust survivor who spent 5 years in prison camps from 13 to 18 years old, survived miraculously. made his way to the United States, and ultimately built hotels throughout the Orlando area in the early 70s and became quite wealthy. Henry started an organization, if your listeners ever want to know about a great organization, called Give Kids the World, which is where most Wish kids, at the time, 80% of all Wish kids wanted to go to Disney World as their wish. And so Henry built a village where the kids could come and stay and then go over to Disney. It's a miraculous place. It is a magical place. So Henry is this guy, I find out. Henry sits down with me and says, hey, I want you to run this thing for me. And I'm like, I don't know anything about running a charitable organization. He's like, you know how to run a business. You know how to run this. This is the same. It's like, well, Henry, I'm not really sure it is. He goes, yes, it is. And Henry he was a force of personality. Wonderful man. He died a few years back, but just a force of personality. You know, as I learned later, Henry's not a person you negotiate with. You just listen to. And so Henry looks at me and he said, here's what you need to know. We're on opposite sides of the same prayer. You need something to do with your life, and I need someone to run this. Now, how do you say no to that? So I started my career running this organization called Dignity You Wear. We took it from this small little charity into a much bigger charity. Eventually, I left there. I went to the food bank in Jacksonville, where I was at the time. I ran the food bank there for a couple of years. Largely, again, got it set up. It had some challenges it was making its way through. I helped kind of get it situated and moving forward, and worked in some other venues in the nonprofit world for a while. And then the folks here at the food bank in Tampa reached out and said, hey, we're looking for somebody, and ended up being a good match for them, good match for me. And so I've been here 12 years.
So Thomas admits he didn't know much about the nonprofit world when he called up his local food bank to ask about volunteering opportunities. But that single moment led him to spend time at several different human service organizations, including multiple food banks. I asked Thomas what about this type of nonprofit organization spoke to him when he was starting his journey.
I don't know, probably because I think now in hindsight, it's a well-known entity or commodity. And if you're in New York City, there's a lot of issues around food, right? There's a whole lot of, right? My ex-wife used to carry granola bars instead of giving, folks who are housing challenged or homeless or transitionally housed money or otherwise, right? You would give them food, right? It was a way to say, hey, I care about you as a human being. So here's a granola bar. Here's, because I don't want to just walk by you as if you don't exist, but handing money to someone in that situation is not the best use of your funds or not the best answer for their situation. So probably, Kate, I was just aware of it and it seemed easy enough. But I did not come from a background. My parents, I never volunteered anything that I'm ever aware of. None of my siblings ever volunteered anything that I'm ever aware of. It was not something that I saw as a part of my personality, but I would say this, and it leads to the answer to your question. Funny reference as to how you end up doing what you do. But so I'm 10 years old, and it's the summer of 1972-73, and my mother is watching the Watergate hearings. So, Kate, you can look that up, right? And it's a really important time in the life of our country, right? And, folks are testifying about what happened. My mother was rapt. She didn't miss a moment of it. She watched every minute of it. And I would talk to her and say, well, what about this? I'd watch some of it with her. I remember, John Dean and all these things. And it sounds arcane, but you ask, these things stick with you. And what I remember her saying was, this isn't just about a president and his behavior. It's about who we are as a country. It's about our responsibility to the truth. It's about our willingness to do what's right. And that stuck with me. And so all of the work I think that I do today still has those core principles attached to it. So I happen to work in a food bank. The irony is I don't really care about food at all as a person. I'm not a culinary, right? I joke with my wife often. I see food, I'll eat it. That's just put it in front of me, I'll eat it, and then I'll do the dishes, right? But I am convinced that every single human being is worthy of investment and care, that our responsibility, not our opportunity, our responsibility is to be there for them and with them. That career journey that I told you about, I can't tell you how many people stepped in and helped me along the way. I couldn't even put a number on it. People like a guy named George Menendez, who when I was a young manager took me under his wing and said, here's how you do this, here's how you do that, here's why you want to think about this. He didn't have to do any of that. But these people made me the person that I am. And I view our work today, what I do today, as living into that principle of the obligation and responsibility we have to look after each other. And so a food bank is a spectacularly wonderful place to do that.
I loved the part where Thomas shared about how his belief that every single human is worthy of investment and care, and that it's our responsibility to show up for them, has shaped how he approaches his day-to-day life. I think it so perfectly captures why many people in the nonprofit industry do what they do, but it also speaks to the culture Thomas and his team members have built at Feeding Tampa Bay. I think you can hear the kind of organization he has helped build through our conversation on his leadership style as well.
There are many challenges to leadership, particularly when you end up sitting in the, I should note for the listener, cubicle that I sit in, right? We don't have offices here at our food bank. Everybody just has a space, right? I think you're aware that when you occupy this spot, the responsibility to understand that other people got you there is really important, because otherwise you can start thinking you're the one that got you there. And I think I've been fortunate that I've kept some degree of fidelity to the idea that other people helped me get into this spot, especially when you think about my origin story and where I came from. There was nothing that ever said I would sit here. The two principles that I mentioned, to you earlier, that, I will work as hard as possible and necessary, and I'll continue to try and do different things so that it challenges me. Those are still two principles I believe in 40 years into my career. And I think because of that, the gift that I've been given is not the abilities, it's the willingness. You tend to think of, I as a leader, I as a human am gifted in X, Y, and Z, and those things may or may not be true, but the best gift you can ever have is the willingness to continue to do things well, right, thoughtfully. So I think that good leadership is about ego deflation at depth. You have to be willing to be vulnerable. It's hard. We have a very democratic system here. I'm not going to die wondering what any of my colleagues think, right? But we've built it that way so that everybody has a voice, everybody has a right and a responsibility. And as a leader, you have to be willing to support that. It's far easier to tell people what to do. It's far more successful to allow them to learn what to do and have them teach you what should be done.
Like many in leadership positions, every day for Thomas looks a little bit different. But he shared that his main objective each and every day is to build capacity in a number of different ways.
So when people ask me my job description, I always say this: my job is to build capacity. So sometimes that's human capacity, as I just talked about. How do I help the folks that work directly for me get better at what they do? How do I help us, so the human right side of things, how do we build an organization where we are engaging in human capacity, right? So one is the human side. Number two is the organizational side. What is it we want to do as an organization? What is our strategic plan? What do we care about? Where are we headed? How do I think about that from a capacity standpoint? We're a food bank that has materially changed our external focus, or the mission imperatives that we have. We've moved far beyond just food. All of that's part of my kind of imprint to say this is where I think we need to go as I think about the capacity of what we want to be. And then, of course, capacity also means what it means, which is to help us develop financial resources, other resources to do that work. Board members, cultivation, all of that. But everything that, if I'm doing my job well, everything that I spend my time on, the outcome of it should be that we have greater capacity as the result of that. So that's how I think about my job. How that comes at you is, every day is different, as you said. I think the thing that I over the years, I've mentored young leaders in the nonprofit world. I think the thing that always surprises them is how little of your time you manage or dictate. I think everybody thinks like once you get to the CEO role that you're just kind of, I'm pulling the strings, I'm making stuff happen. By the time you get to this seat, you have less control over your day, your to-do list, your wants and needs than you have ever had in your entire career. That's neither bad nor good, but it certainly is true. And so a lot of what I have to do is to adapt and adjust to figure out, how this problem, this opportunity, this situation came at us. What do we do about it? What do I do about it? I tend to be the person in an organization where someone has come to the end of their they've hit a wall with something they're dealing with, and they walk into my, workstation and say, "Hey, I think